Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Monday morning live Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. My name is Julian. We're going to be here live for about 30 minutes, and this lecture is going to be about the Lacanian concept of the fundamental fantasy. I'm going to try to provide you with a basic introduction and definition of that concept, but I also want to talk a little bit about the film Blade Runner and some other thoughts along the way. Thank you to the patrons who allow me to keep hosting these live sessions. If you'd like to become a patron and download every lecture as an audio file, I'm currently recording this, as you can see. Please do consider going to www.patreon.com/JulianPhilosophy, where you can also join my ebook subscription, where every 3 months we release a ebook that accompanies the lecture series. In fact, today we're beginning a new lecture series, which is going to be on the idea of subjective destitution, or what Lacan calls constitutive decentrament of the subject. But fret not, it's not going to be entirely abstract as that, not as abstract as that might appear to indicate. Hello to those of you joining us from around the world. I see someone from Athens, Greece. Lovely that we are connecting globally. Okay, let's simply jump right in. So, I want to talk about the fundamental fantasy because the purported aim of Lacanian psychoanalytic treatment is to allow the subject to traverse the fundamental fantasy, to overcome it. And that begs the question, what is the fundamental fantasy? Well, the simplest definition of the fundamental fantasy is that it is the phenomenal self-experience of the subject, which is an abstract way of saying it is the inner core of the subject's self-experience. For example, if a scientist approaches you and says, what you experience as love is simply a biological pheromonal mechanism that appears to you as love, the subject will nevertheless say, yes, I know this to be true, and yet still to me, this is love because it speaks to me. It is something in me that is love. This is for Lacan the fundamental fantasy, the phenomenal self-experience of the subject, that there is an inner truth, an inner core of the subject's experience that is authentic. However, it's important to note that the Lacanian traversing the fundamental fantasy is not simply a materialist demystification of the subject, by which I mean to say, the standard materialist interpretation or gesture is that what appears to you as authentic behavior is in fact manipulation, is in fact the result of some puppet master influencing you, be it through propaganda, brainwashing, or other capitalist incentive structures. The Lacanian gesture, however, is not this form of pseudo-materialism. It's not to say that what appears to you as your authentic inner experience has to be demystified so that you might access the true authentic you. Because think about it, this pseudo-materialist gesture nevertheless follows the logic of the fundamental fantasy. The idea being that you are manipulated into the incentive structures of some master, and if you are able to liberate yourself from this master figure or agent, you will be free to be authentically yourself. In other words, this very paranoid hermeneutic, what in orthodox Marxist circles used to be called the hermeneutics of suspicion, nevertheless follows the central logic that underneath the surface, underneath the appearance, there is some true authentic core to the subject. The Lacanian argument, in contrast to this, is that truth lies only in appearance, that truth lies within the phenomenal self-experience as such, which to say, paradoxically, to traverse the fundamental fantasy isn't simply to reject the idea that there is some inner core truth, but to locate the nexus of this truth within the phenomenal appearance itself. Or, to put it in classic metaphysical binary terms, essence versus appearance, Lacan places the onus on appearance. Truth lies not beyond the veil of appearances, it lies within appearance as such. Hence, the Lacanian aim of psychoanalytic treatment, to traverse the fundamental fantasy, isn't simply to suggest that there is no authentic core or site of truth, but to displace the site of truth into that which originally appeared to be that barring it from said truth, phenomenal experience. Now, this is quite abstract, so I'm going to try to give you some examples. One example that I like to use is the film Blade Runner. So, when we first encounter Blade Runner, it appears to be a simple binary between humans on the one hand and replicants on the other. And the humans are the true, authentic human subjects. The replicants are the fake, the simulacra. And yet, a careful analysis or observation of Blade Runner's logic and narrative mechanism reveals almost the exact opposite, which is to say, the most human gesture is precisely to doubt whether or not you are truly human. Which is to say, authentic human subjectivity is not about being human or replicant. It is precisely the gap as to the phenomenal appearance of human subjectivity or being a replicant to itself. In fact, you could have an even more radical reading of the film Blade Runner and suggest that what makes you most human is precisely this very indeterminacy, by which, therefore, the replicant who realizes that he is a replicant is the most human subject. This would be the most radical interpretation of Blade Runner, the one that I personally enjoy, which is that the replicants, in becoming self-conscious of their identity of replicants, therein become the authentic human subject. And vice versa, the human who confidently asserts his own humanity in the face of the replicants is therefore himself a replicant. Here we have the dialectical inversion that the film implies. Dumb humanity that is confident of its identity is therefore replicant-like, a mere android machine walking through the earth in its stupid, naive, self-confident certainty as to its identity. The replicant who realizes that he is replicant and who assumes the radical self-doubt, the constitutive decentrament of his identity, is thereby precisely the most human. Once again, the materialist gesture here is not simply the basic act of demystification, who is human and who is not, which itself always has a certain reactionary logic. Think about the demystification that lies behind certain eugenicist practices, who is pure-blooded and who is not. But instead, the act of demystification, in a properly materialist sense, is precisely to point out that the fundamental constitutive certainty of the subject is itself fake, inasmuch as the self-identification as to this gap is what constitutes true subjectivity or humanity. To repeat in a somewhat simpler form, the replicant who realizes his status as replicant is therefore properly human, whereas the human who is confident in his identity and does not doubt it acts as a replicant, acts as a mere automaton, as it were. Hence why one of the brilliant innovations of the sequel to the Blade Runner film, which I thought was actually a very, very good adaptation by the director Denis Villeneuve, who also more recently made the Dune films. One of the brilliant insights of Denis Villeneuve is that the core of the Blade Runner movie revolves around nostalgia, which is to say, nostalgia as the loss of innocence. And the ultimate loss of innocence is, of course, the loss as to the innocence of the certainty of one's self-identity. Therefore, to realize that one can no longer truly trust that one is human, or in reverse, the replicant who discovers that his self-belief of being human is therefore no longer true, that is the ultimate loss. The loss of the certainty as to our own identity thereby induces nostalgia in the subject. Arguably, every human adult subject is already a subject of nostalgia, this subjectivity of loss, the loss that comes with subjectivity proper. Which is to say, when you're young, when you're very young, you have this naive, foolish certainty as to yourself. I exist, I have a parent, I live in this enclosed symbolic universe, and there's a certain satisfaction, a naive bliss, a kind of Edenic confidence that comes with this state of being. And yet, as Hegel already points out, the point of maturation for the subject of entering into the world, what Lacan would later call the symbolic order, takes place precisely when the subject is confronted with his radical alienation from the symbolic order. That the child who enters into life realizes that the coordinates of his existence hitherto no longer apply to the actual real world. Here we can actually see the Hegelian concept of madness and how madness is constitutive to the subject. From a Hegelian perspective, madness is a vanishing mediator between this childlike bliss, the naive, stupid subject, and the subject of rational consciousness, the subject in the world. Which is to say, first the subject must go into the world, realize that his quote-unquote authentic childlike self has no bearings upon this world, cannot survive. The subject then retreats into an inner world in which he reconstitutes himself, builds up his own fantasies, as it were. Who am I? How do I present myself to the other? Then re-enters into the symbolic order, into life. Madness, therefore, is in this precise sense constitutive to the subject. Madness of realizing the inadequacy of this naive child who then has to build up his fantasies so as to be in the world. In fact, the ultimate moment of madness as constitutive negativity for Hegel comes when the subject recognizes himself as other and accepts himself as other. Hence why Hegel uses the image of an eye looking into itself as the image of madness in The Night of the World. Hegel says that an eye that looks into the mirror and looks into itself, therefore enters into this night of the world. Here we have one of the primordial images of Lacanian constitutive decentrament. The subject who recognizes himself as other, who thereby is able to constitute himself as a fantasy frame for the other. Now, we're going a little bit fast here, and I realize that I'm sort of like laying jargon upon jargon and abstraction upon abstraction, so let's take a step back for a moment. What exactly is the subject of the unconscious? The Freudian discovery of the subject of the unconscious? Well, one way to answer that question is to begin by radically rejecting what it is not. The Freudian subject of the unconscious is not the subject who is being secretly guided by some inner repressed content. This would be the simple pseudo-Freudian take, that we have man who is governed by unacknowledged repressed urges or inclinations that come out, the return of the repressed. For example, this would be the idea that the Freudian slip is revealing what the subject truly thinks. Like, the subject has a dirty thought, and in the Freudian slip, the repressed thought somehow comes out. It slips through its bondage. And yet this is precisely, excuse me, it's very dry today. We're having a bit of a heat wave. The point of the subject of the unconscious is precisely not this idea of the repression as a repressive agency through which the truth can slip every once in a while. Instead, it's much more uncanny. The argument is that repression itself generates something excessive to the subject, something genuinely new, something foreign to the subject, in which the subject realizes himself. To go back to the idea of the Freudian slip for a moment. The Freudian slip is not the release of some repressed thought. Instead, it is repression itself, I should not say something, that allows something new, something genuinely weird and strange to the subject itself to emerge. How did I just say that? What does that even mean? And it's important to note here that the subject of the unconscious is therefore not the subject that is contrasted with the world or the realm of the unconscious, which secretly governs its desires, but almost the exact other way around. That it is precisely repression itself that generates a new constitutive element, an excessive plus one, universal exception, as it were, which and wherein which resides the subject. Hence, the central Freudian insight is that there's therefore precisely no true or authentic subject underneath the repression. Instead, repression itself generates that which you might call authentic subjectivity. Here you can see how the Lacanian, traversing the fundamental fantasy, radicalizes the Freudian principle. Instead of trying to eliminate repression so as to be united with the true authentic core of the subject, one must instead eliminate the very fantasy that something lies underneath. In fact, here you can see the basic difference between the idea of the subconscious and the unconscious. The subconscious is the idea that there is something underneath, some layer of our being that we cannot access that lies underneath the surface. Whereas the unconscious is precisely the idea that there is nothing underneath, that repression itself is repressing the fact that there is nothing concealed underneath, and this yields something new, excessive, foreign to the subject, which nevertheless contains the truth of the subject as such. To take a step back for a moment, I think this is very similar to what Alenka Zupancic argued when she said that there were two humiliations of man within the 20th century. The first being, well, not even just the 20th century, within the 19th and 20th century. The first humiliation of man is the Darwinian theory of evolution. Man is no longer simply the universal exception, the Adam's progeny, etc. Instead, man is evolved from mere ape. Here we have the first decentering of the subject, the first humiliation of man, as it were. The second humiliation or decentering of the subject is the Freudian subject of the unconscious. Namely, not man who has an authentic core of his own being that he must learn to regulate or unearth, but instead that man is most himself precisely when he is indeterminate as to what his true actions or authentic desires are. To put that in a very simple formula, Darwin's decentrament teaches us that we didn't know where we came from. The Freudian decentrament teaches us that we didn't know what makes us on a psychological level. In other words, the subject is most himself when he realizes how not himself he is. The Lacanian argument about radical constitutive decentrament is therefore that when the subject is confronted with something that cannot be integrated into its libidinal economy, into its fantasy frame, this is precisely when the subject is most himself. Hence, Zupancic's basic argument here is that the subject of the unconscious is not something that lies underneath, but instead that something that is realized or recognized by the subject, inasmuch as there appears to be some radical excessive kernel that cannot be integrated back into the libidinal economy of the subject. To go back to my formula, what makes you most human is precisely this very indeterminacy. Is this really me speaking, or is something else speaking through me? In fact, once again, the naive subject is the one who believes that he has an inner core which speaks. I am me, and these are my beliefs, and this is what I'm going to do because I am true to myself. In fact, you could say that within contemporary capitalism, this onus is precisely on this fantasy. Go to a museum gallery to contemplate yourself, practice self-love, take care of yourself, etc. Don't allow yourself to be taken in by alienation. Return to authentic living by means of yoga and mindfulness, etc. Therefore, this very desire to stage a return to authentic subjectivity is itself symptomatic of the very alienation within capitalism. Moreover, the supposed return to authentic living is staged as an area where you can recharge your batteries, as it were, so as to enter back into capitalist alienated life and be thereby more productive. Hence, the argument here is that the authentic core of your being is itself an illusion, a veil that is being held in front of you. And the Lacanian argument is that truth lies within this very appearance. In other words, the fundamental fantasy is the phenomenal self-experience of the subject, not as an underlying authentic core of its being, but instead the realization or recognition as to the phenomenal quality of the very appearance of the subject's authentic being. Again, very abstract. I'm fully aware of this. So let's try to have some examples here. I want to go back to the Freudian slip for a moment, because there's an example that I like to use from Faulty Towers, which is a wonderful comedy series that focuses on a man who owns a hotel in the countryside of the United Kingdom. And there's an episode called, I think it's called Don't Mention the War, in which a group of German guests arrive at the hotel, and the proprietor of the hotel, Basil Fawlty, is told, no matter what you do, don't mention the war. This is the one thing that you can't talk about. And so he does everything he can to be polite. And yet, in his very politesse, in his politeness and trying not to mention the war, he keeps catching himself making what appears to be tacit reference to the war. And what's funny is the Germans don't even really appear to notice. They're not caught within this double bind. Instead, it is Faulty himself who is tormented because he is thinking that everything he could say might be interpreted as being an allusion to the history of war between the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and Germany, or the Nazi Reich at the time. Of course, what happens at the end of this episode is that he succumbs to a kind of hysterical madness in which he goes fully the other way and starts hysterically shrieking about the war, goose-stepping and pretending to be Hitler in front of the, at first, bemused and then somewhat outraged patrons. In other words, the very thing that he is trying desperately to avoid, he brings about by means of trying to avoid it. And here we have the central logic of the Freudian slip. The Freudian slip isn't revealing what you really were not trying to say. Instead, the Freudian slip is some excessive madness that occurs precisely by means of the very act of repression itself. The more he tries not to talk about the war, the more he ends up acting out a foolish, excessive caricature of what Germans might be in the mind of Brits. In fact, here we see something very similar when it comes to Freudian dream analysis. Hence the relationship between dream analysis for Freud and the Freudian slip, both of which are ways in which the unconscious speaks or signifies. When a patient says that he has a dream, but it was definitely not about his mother, we can, by definition, say that the dream was about his mother. In other words, the very thing that it's not supposed to be is the very thing it is about. Hence why Freud always argues that the content of the dream is not to be trusted, not particularly of interest. Instead, it is the latent dream content, what he calls the process of the dream work, through which the repressed content is revealed in its very form. In other words, Freud is essentially practicing what would become the elementary gesture of the critique of ideology, the content that is hidden within the form as such. And now you can actually make the leap back to Lacan and see how Lacan radicalizes this Freudian principle. Namely, if the authentic core of the subject is not that which lies beneath, namely, if it is not about the content as to the authentic being of the subject, instead this content must be found within the hidden form of its constitution, namely the process of repression or the very way in which it does not appear to the subject. Hence why for Lacan, traversing the fundamental fantasy is moving beyond the analysis of the mere or supposed content of the subject's self-identity towards the recognition of the content that lies within the form, or to be precise, the form of impossibility as to the appearance of this content itself. This is the subject of the unconscious, the content hidden within the form as to the new or excessive subjectivity that emerges by means of repression as such. Are we going too fast here? This is the first lecture, so we're just laying out some of the basic components. At least that's my goal here. Okay, so let's try to lay out some things. What is the unconscious, therefore? Strictly speaking, the unconscious is the inaccessible phenomenon, namely the core or kernel that the subject cannot access. There is something that appears radically alien to the subject, and yet within this very quality reveals true subjectivity. Hence, the authentic subject is the subject of loss, the subject who has lost the certainty as to its self-transparent identity. Now, here it's important to note that Zizek has always argued that Lacan is actually a Cartesian thinker. But that appears to be strange to us because if the Cartesian, maxim or imperative, is to achieve self-transparency for the subject, I think, therefore I am, then Lacan appears to be arguing the exact opposite, right? Lacan has the I am not where I think and I think where I am not, his reworking of the Cartesian cogito. So why would the Lacanian traversing the fundamental fantasy nevertheless be the staging ground for what you might call a Cartesian self-transparent subject? Well, there's two ways to answer that. The simple way to answer it is that traversing the fundamental fantasy, even though it rejects the idea of an authentic content of the subject, nevertheless remains true to the demystifying process by which such a content might be unearthed, except now it is the content that is hidden within the very form of repression as such. That's the simple answer, or simple in quotation marks. The difficult answer can be laid out by means of the Lacanian difference between the subject of the enunciation and the subject of the enunciated. And here you can actually see how Lacan essentially applies a structuralist or linguistic Saussurean theory of the signifier to the Cartesian project of self-transparent subjectivity. So what is the difference between the subject of the enunciation and the subject of the enunciated? The subject of the enunciation is simply the subject who speaks. The subject who believes that he has an authentic platform from which he projects his inner truth onto the world. Of course, inner truth is itself a modern concept, but essentially what I mean is a subject who trusts his own phenomenal self-appearance. I equals I, and therefore I think, therefore I am, therefore I speak. The subject of the enunciated, however, is the subject who is caught within the irreducible chain or sequence of the signifier as such. As Hegel already said, as soon as we speak, we are doomed. As soon as we speak, we are caught in the very chain of signification, the chain or the order of being, to put it in Saussurean terms. Which is to say, as soon as you speak, you are not only misinterpreting that which you supposedly originally thought, if such a thing even exists, but secondly, you are also framing your very speech so that it might be interpreted by the other, which means that you are anticipating in advance how this message will be received by the other. Lacan's basic argument is that even if the message is not received, it is already in advance, always already received. In other words, it is always already or a priori structured as if it were no longer the message of the subject, but in fact the message intended to go to the recipient. Here you could say how, for example, the subject speaks to himself by speaking to the other. The subject exists by means of being for the other. Like St. Francis of Assisi, who speaks or lectures to the birds. He stages his own being by means of positing it in the face of an irreducible other, namely the birds who don't respond or speak to him. In fact, strictly speaking, this could be true for anything. As soon as you have a piece of paper and you start writing down, the question is, who are you writing for? It's like when people write in their journal and they say, "Dear Diary," and they're addressing the diary. This very mechanism already stages the central Lacanian position of the subject of the enunciated. Hence why Lacan liked to say that it is not you who is speaking, it is you who is speaking, who is being spoken through. You do not speak language, language speaks you. Or as Lacan quips, apropos Heidegger, language is not simply a house in which we live, language is a prison house in which we are tormented. And yet, for Lacan, to be the subject of the enunciated, to exist in the symbolic framework, which is irreducibly connected to the other, is precisely to find the place in which subjectivity emerges. Hence why the idea of the pure subject of the enunciation is itself the fantasy, the fundamental fantasy, which has to be traversed so that one might recognize the truth of the subject of the enunciation. Here we can see how Lacan remains true to the Cartesian principle, the idea of self-transparency. The self-transparent subject is not the subject who believes that he is the pure subject of enunciation. It is the one who recognizes precisely the supposedly impure quality of being the subject of the enunciated. Now, what does this have to do with psychoanalysis, to conclude? Well, the basic premise of psychoanalysis is that the psychoanalyst is the one who is supposed to induce hysteria in the psychotic subject. Now, this seems quite bizarre to say because we often think of it as the other way around. We have a hysteric subject who goes to the psychotherapist to be put at ease so that he might return back to a content, blissful, quote-unquote psychotic state in which everything is fine. The Lacanian gesture is to say, you should be angry, you should be out of joint, you should be confused as to what your true intentions are. This very indeterminacy marks you as an authentic subject. Any attempt to achieve the opposite, to essentially bring the subject back into joint, to assuage his doubts or worries, to make him assume the fantasy as to the inner content of his being, would therefore be antithetical to Lacanian psychoanalysis. Here we can see one of the differences, at least in a general way, between the idea of clinical therapy, which is supposed to help the subject access the fantasy frame of his existence, to be a better parent, a better lover, etc., versus the Lacanian one that challenges the subject to assume the very indeterminate character of the fantasy frame as such, and thereby to achieve emancipation. In other words, the challenge for the patient in psychoanalytic treatment is not simply to go back and fully be absorbed in the fantasy frame, nor, strictly speaking, is it to succumb to Hegelian madness, to achieve full subjective destitution, as it were, to fall into the void in which no appearance has any kind of hold or certainty. Instead, it is up to the subject to achieve a kind of mastery, a kind of discipline or routine over this very indeterminacy, to embrace it, to accept it, and to thereby become the one who takes control of it. The psychoanalyst is therefore the one who confronts the subject with this indeterminacy, with this inconsistency, who validates it and affirms it in that sense. And of course, on a very basic human level, this happens to all of us. We are never certain as to our own actions. Are we thinking this because it's our own thought? Are we thinking it because somebody else wants us to? Am I speaking in anger? Am I speaking in frustration? Am I speaking out of sadness? What do I really want? The central lesson of psychoanalysis is therefore is that we do not know what we want, but perhaps more crucially, we do not even know where this wanting would come from. We do not know who we are. We are lost, as it were. And psychoanalysis, from a Lacanian perspective, tries to withhold from us the very certainty of phenomenal self-experience, a you who can be tapped into, who can be trusted, and therein creates the staging ground for the emancipation of the subject who understands that this indeterminacy is what makes him subject, is what makes him alive. That's the basic argument here. Okay, so that's been a 30-minute introduction to the idea of the fundamental fantasy and the traversing of the fundamental fantasy. This is a lot, but fret not. We're going to have 12 weeks of recurring lectures to flesh this concept out. This is going to be a lecture series on subjective destitution and traversing the fundamental fantasy, which begins today. If you'd like to download my introduction to the Freudian death drive, which tacitly relates to this, you can find that on my Patreon. The latest text is called The Silence of the Drives, which seeks to answer a seemingly simple question, namely, if the unconscious speaks, then why do the drives remain silent? Or what Lacan designates as the silence of the drives. And yes, I see the Discord gang comment. We will see you. Jenlene is back. We will see you on Discord in 5 minutes. All right, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you soon.